They had built something most people would call a good life. A house with clean lines, a marriage with clean rules, and a shared understanding that love at a certain point becomes less about feeling and more about tending. Daniel was a structural engineer who believed in load-bearing walls, in things that hold. Claire had climbed steadily through a marketing firm, driven by a quiet hunger she never fully named. Between them lived 11 years of loyalty, 2 miscarriages, neither had properly mourned, and a comfort so practiced it had slowly become performance. The tension in their marriage was not the loud kind. It was the kind that lives in the pause before answering a simple question, in the way 2 people can share a bed and still sleep in completely separate countries. What would unravel them was not a dramatic betrayal so much as a slow substitution of presence for proximity, of intimacy for arrangement, and one man who understood, with surgical precision, exactly where the seams were. The Tuesday Claire brought Marcus home, Daniel was making pasta. Not because it was Tuesday and Tuesdays called for pasta, but because it had gradually become the rhythm of their evenings. Daniel home by 6:30, Claire by 7 or 7:15, and dinner as the structure around which they arranged their silences. He heard the front door, heard 2 sets of footsteps, and turned from the stove with a wooden spoon still in his hand. Claire was already explaining before she'd removed her coat. "This is Marcus. I've told you about him, my assistant. The firm put him in that terrible service department off the bypass, and I just thought, genuinely, with the spare room sitting there." Daniel looked at Marcus Holt. He was perhaps 30, lean in the way people are when they carry tension rather than muscle, with a considered kind of handsomeness, the sort that doesn't announce itself, but accumulates. He held a weekend bag in one hand and extended the other toward Daniel with a smile that landed somewhere between grateful and practiced. "I appreciate it," Marcus said. "Truly. I told Claire it was too much." "It's nothing," Daniel said, because the pasta was boiling and Claire was already moving toward the kitchen. And sometimes the path of least friction is the path you take. That first evening passed without incident. Marcus ate what Daniel made, complimented it genuinely, washed his own dishes without being asked, and excused himself by 9 with a book under his arm. Claire seemed lighter than she had in months. Brighter, somehow, in the way people are when they've been seen recently. Daniel noticed this the way you notice a draft without yet knowing which window is open. They had been not quite arguing for most of the past year, not fighting, precisely. Neither of them were fighters, which had always seemed like a virtue and was perhaps the problem. Claire had stopped initiating physical closeness sometime around autumn, and Daniel, too proud or too tired to draw attention to it, had simply adjusted. They still touched, occasionally, in the automatic way of long-coupled people, a hand on the shoulder passing the coffee, a brief contact in the hallway, but something with temperature had gone. He told himself it was the miscarriage. The second one, 14 months ago. They'd gone to the hospital together, driven home in near silence, and then inexplicably to him, never spoken about it. He had assumed Claire needed time. He waited. She moved on outwardly, returning to work within the week, filing it somewhere internal that he didn't have access to. He had wanted to go there with her. She hadn't opened the door. The spare room was at the end of the hall. Claire had repainted it 2 summers ago in a sage green she'd chosen from a paint swatch for 20 minutes. She'd said it would be good for guests. They rarely had guests. The night Marcus arrived, after Claire had gone upstairs, Daniel stood in the kitchen longer than necessary. He drained the pasta water, wiped the counter, turned off the overhead light. The house felt, in some minor and inexplicable way, differently weighted, as though a piece of furniture had been moved 2 inches to the left, not enough to trip over, just enough to notice the floor where it used to be. He went up to find Claire already reading, or appearing to read. He brushed his teeth, changed, got into bed. She said without lowering her book, "It's just temporary. A month, maybe 6 weeks." "I know," Daniel said. She turned a page. He looked at the ceiling. 6 weeks, he thought. He could carry 6 weeks. He fell asleep to the faint sound of someone else's light still on at the end of the hall. By the 3rd week, Daniel had learned Marcus's habits. He was an early riser, up before Claire, coffee made, the kitchen already quiet by the time Daniel came down. He did not leave crumbs or rings on the counter. He was the kind of person who placed things back exactly where he found them, which Daniel recognized later as a particular kind of skill, the appearance of not disturbing anything while in fact rearranging everything. Claire had started coming home later, not dramatically so. 20 minutes, 30, once nearly an hour. She had explanations that were not untrue, a client presentation, a vendor meeting that ran long, drinks with a colleague. But Daniel noticed the quality of her tiredness had changed. She used to come home depleted. Now she came home with a particular brightness that dimmed slightly when she saw him, like a screen adjusting to a different room. They still ate together most evenings, the three of them, and this was the strangest part, how domestically ordinary it all looked. Marcus was easy company. He asked Daniel real questions about his work in a way that seemed genuinely interested rather than politely obligatory, and Daniel, who rarely talked about load calculations or tensile stress at dinner, found himself explaining things, drawing rough diagrams on napkins. Marcus listened with his whole body, which Daniel recognized as a talent some people had, and others spent their entire lives failing to replicate. "You actually care about the invisible parts," Marcus said one night over a takeaway Claire had brought home. "Most people only see the building. You're thinking about what holds it up." "That's the job," Daniel said. "It's more than that, though. You see failure before it happens." Claire glanced between them, something passing across her face that Daniel couldn't fully read. Later, when Marcus had gone to his room and Claire was loading the dishwasher, Daniel said quietly, "He's perceptive. He's good at people," Claire said. She said it the way you say a fact. "It's why he's good at his job." "What does he actually do for you?" She paused, a glass in her hand. "Scheduling. Communications. He manages the client-facing calendar. He's been genuinely useful." Daniel nodded. He believed her. That was the thing. Everything she said was plausibly true, technically accurate, and somehow entirely inadequate as a full account. He began paying a quieter kind of attention. He noticed how Claire described her day differently now. Less about tasks, more about moments. Marcus suggested we reframe the pitch. Marcus caught something in the brief I'd missed. The name appeared in her sentences the way a word will once you've learned it. Everywhere, suddenly, having apparently always been there. One evening, Daniel came home to find them on the back porch. They were not touching. They were not even sitting particularly close. Claire was laughing. A laugh he recognized but hadn't heard in some time, loose and unguarded. And Marcus was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was too still to be casual. They didn't hear Daniel come in. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching without quite deciding to watch, before turning and going upstairs to change. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while. The question forming in him wasn't the obvious one, are they? Because in the end, that question is almost secondary. The real question was quieter and more corrosive. When did she stop laughing like that with me? And did I notice? And did I do anything? And if I didn't, what does that say? He didn't have an answer. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He was still sitting there when Claire called up from the kitchen to ask if he wanted tea. "Sure," he called back. His voice came out normal. He was surprised by this. Downstairs, Marcus was explaining something about a campaign strategy, and Claire was listening, and the sound of it, easy, reciprocal, animated, drifted up through the floor like warmth from somewhere he wasn't. He thought about what Marcus had said. You see failure before it happens. He wondered when he'd stopped applying that to things other than buildings. Then the conversation happened. It was unremarkable in its setting, a Saturday afternoon. Claire at the dining table with her laptop, Daniel reading nearby. Marcus was somewhere in the house. The light was that particular flat gray of late autumn. Claire said, without looking up, "I feel like you've been distant lately." Daniel lowered his book. "I've been home every evening. That's not what I mean. I know." A pause. She closed her laptop halfway. "I think we've just gotten very routine," she said. "We've been routine for years," Daniel said. "We both chose that. I didn't choose to feel invisible." He felt the sentence land, not like an accusation, more like a door opening onto a room that had been locked so long they'd both forgotten it existed. "I don't make you feel invisible," he said carefully. "Not on purpose." He looked at her. She was looking at the table. "Sometimes," she said. "I don't know. Maybe like." She stopped, glanced around slightly strangely, as if suddenly and briefly aware of something beyond the room. Like the story, or subscribe, or something. She blinked. A small, confused pause. Daniel stared at her. "What?" She shook her head, the strangeness already dissolving from her face. "Nothing. I don't know why I said that." She opened her laptop again. "I just mean I feel unseen, Daniel. I have for a while." He said nothing for a long moment. "I've been here," he said finally. "I've been right here." She didn't answer. Which was, he thought, its own kind of answer. He found the emails by accident, not by snooping. He wanted to be clear about that, even if only to himself. Claire had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she showered, and he'd moved it to make room for the grocery bags, and the screen had shifted, and there they were, a thread, recent, between her and Marcus. He stood with a bag of groceries still in his hand and read just enough. They were not explicit. They were in many ways more disturbing for not being explicit. The language was intimate in the particular way of people who have built a private world, references in jokes, observations about him, about Daniel, that were written with a tender pity that felt worse than contempt. "He doesn't really see you. He never has." "I see you." Marcus's words, measured and assured. Claire's responses were the part that stayed with Daniel longest. Not passionate or reckless, careful almost, as if she were still deciding, as if she were someone testing ice. He put the groceries away. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and thought about what to do next with the deliberateness of someone diffusing something. Claire came downstairs freshly dressed, and they had an entirely ordinary conversation about whether they needed more milk. He watched her face during it. She was a good dissembler, not because she was fundamentally dishonest, but because she convinced herself that what she was doing existed outside of the marriage, in a parallel category, and therefore didn't require immediate acknowledgement. That evening, after Marcus had gone to the gym, Daniel said, "I'd like to talk." She looked up from her phone. Something in his tone. They sat at the kitchen table, her choice, and he thought about what it meant that she chose a table rather than the sofa, the choice of people who need a surface between them. "I saw the emails," he said, not loudly, not as a weapon. She went completely still. "I wasn't looking," he added, "for whatever that's worth." A long pause. He watched the sequence move through her. Denial, assessment, calculation. Something that might have been relief at finally being known. "It hasn't. We haven't." "I know," he said. "That's not actually the point." She met his eyes. "The point," he said, "is that you've been letting him say things to you that you should have been saying to me, or that I should have been saying to you, and neither of us was, and somewhere in that gap he found something to stand in." She looked away. "You make it sound like I was careless. I think we both were." "Don't make this symmetrical, Daniel. It isn't." "I know it isn't," he said, and meant it. "You're the one who let him in. But I'm the one who made enough room that letting him in felt like the obvious thing to do." She had prepared, he could tell, for anger, for accusation. She hadn't prepared for this, for measured ownership, for a man who refused to perform betrayal the way it was supposed to be performed. It disarmed her, and the disarmament made her uncomfortable, and in her discomfort she became, briefly, defensive. "He listens," she said. I know," Daniel said. "I've watched him." A silence. "He's very good," Daniel said. And he meant this too. Not bitterly, but with the flatness of recognition. He knew exactly what was missing and exactly how to fill it. That's a skill, Claire. It's not admiration. It's not love. It's navigation. She looked at him with something that might have been uncertainty. "I think he should leave," Daniel said. She didn't argue. She nodded, once, slowly, like someone receiving a diagnosis they'd half expected. "And then we should probably figure out what we're doing," he said. He got up and poured his coffee down the sink, not because he didn't want it, but because he needed something to do with his hands. "Daniel," she said. He turned. "I'm sorry," she said. Plain, undecorated. "I know," he said. "So am I." Marcus left on a Thursday. He was gracious about it. Of course he was, shaking Daniel's hand with what appeared to be genuine regret. Telling Claire he hoped things worked out. He took his weekend bag and his book and the particular quality of attention he carried with him everywhere, and the house felt both emptier and more honest for his absence. But the damage he'd done wasn't the kind that leaves when a person leaves. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Daniel attempted a kind of reconciliation that neither of them could quite name. They went to dinner once, deliberately, at a restaurant they'd liked early in their marriage. They talked about the food and about work, and once, briefly, about the second miscarriage, which surfaced unexpectedly between the main course and dessert and then sank again before they could fully reach it. It was progress of a kind, acknowledging the depth without yet being able to swim there. But Claire was also, simultaneously, rewriting the story inside her head. Daniel could see it happening in increments. The version of events she was constructing was not dishonest exactly. It was selective in the way grief always is. In her version, Marcus had simply been a symptom of a failing marriage, and the marriage had been failing because Daniel was emotionally unavailable, and her emotional turn towards someone else was therefore understandable, almost logical. The thing that was conspicuously absent from this narrative was Marcus's own agency, his deliberateness, his methods. She told a friend over coffee, Daniel had heard, peripherally, from someone in their shared circle, that things had been complicated and that she'd needed to feel something. He understood the need to be the protagonist of your own difficulty. He'd done it himself, in his way. What neither of them knew yet, what was still assembling itself in the background, was that Marcus had not simply moved on. In the 2 months following his departure from their spare room, Marcus Holt had been quietly, methodically building something. He had, during his weeks in their house, listened with his extraordinary attentiveness to a great deal, including one evening when Daniel had spoken freely over a second glass of wine, the details of a property investment Daniel had been managing with a business partner, a development project. Significant in value, structurally complex, the kind of thing that required trust and non-disclosure, and the sort of informal handshake arrangements that don't survive scrutiny. Marcus had, in the months before taking the position as Claire's assistant, worked briefly in financial consultancy. This was in his employment history, though Claire had never thought to look at it closely, and Daniel had never had reason to look at all. He had, in the course of his extraordinary listening, gathered enough to approach Daniel's business partner privately. What he offered was leverage, not crude blackmail, but the more sophisticated version, information, selectively deployed, with the implied promise that its full deployment could be avoided. The business partner, alarmed, had paid him in a way that restructured an arrangement, quietly, legally at the surface, catastrophically for Daniel beneath it. Daniel found out in November. He sat in his car outside his solicitor's office for 20 minutes before going in. The numbers being explained to him were not ruinous. He was not destitute, would not lose the house, but significant enough that they represented years of accumulated work, quietly undone through a series of decisions his business partner had made under pressure. Neither had disclosed to the other. The thread, when followed, led back to Marcus. Daniel sat with it for a week before telling Claire. He watched her face very carefully when he did. What he saw there wasn't guilt, or not primarily guilt. What he saw first was disbelief, and then a horrible cascading recognition. She had given Marcus access to the house, to their conversations, to the shape of their vulnerabilities. She had not engineered this. She had been used as infrastructure. "He used me," she said, very quietly. "Yes," Daniel said. She was silent for a long time. "Did you know?" she asked. "Before you." "No," he said. "I found out the same way you just did." Another silence. "I'm going to take it to a solicitor," Daniel said. "There may be limited recourse, but I want it on record." Of course, she said. Her voice was strange, hollowed out. The clarity she'd been constructing for months. The narrative in which she was a woman who had sought something real in an heirless marriage had just been reframed, irrevocably, around a different center. She had not been desired, she had been identified, assessed, positioned. The intimacy Marcus had offered her had been real in its textures, the listening, the seeing. But it had been instrumentalized, woven into a longer calculation that had never been about her at all. This was, Daniel understood, possibly the worst thing. Not the affair, that wasn't quite an affair, not the financial damage, but the particular cruelty of discovering that even your betrayal wasn't really about you. He didn't say this. There was nothing useful in saying it. He made tea. He sat across from her. Outside, November moved through the garden in its gray and methodical way. They separated in January, not with lawyers, initially, and not with the kind of rupture that becomes a story people tell. They separated the way a house develops a crack that runs so deep into the foundation that nothing is structurally visible from the outside. And then one day a wall simply will not hold the weight anymore. Claire moved into a flat on the other side of the city. It was a good flat, clean, well lit, in a neighborhood she'd always liked. She furnished it carefully, deliberately, in the way people decorate new spaces when they're trying to write themselves into something. Daniel stayed in the house. He repainted the spare room. They met once in March at a coffee shop equidistant between their addresses. His suggestion, and she'd appreciated the fairness of it. They sat by the window with drinks they didn't really need and talked with the measured care of two people who have handled something breakable for so long that the caution has become indistinguishable from the habit of it. She looked, he thought, tired. Not unhappily so. More like someone who has put something down that they've been carrying for a long time and was still adjusting to the change in posture. The solicitor says there's not much to be done, Daniel said. She nodded. She'd already known. Financially, I mean, he added. It's manageable. It'll take time. I know. She turned her cup in her hands. I feel responsible. You didn't know what he was doing. I let him into our life. We both did, Daniel said. And then, I keep thinking about why it worked, why it was so easy for him. She looked at him. It worked, he said slowly. Because there was already so much space in us. We'd made it over years without realizing. He just moved into the space. She said nothing for a moment. Through the window, the March street moved in that early spring way, a tentative warmth, nothing committed. I wanted to be known, she said finally. Her voice was neither an apology nor an accusation. It was simply true. I've forgotten how to ask you to know me. So I stopped asking. I stopped looking, he said. They both considered that. Do you think we could have fixed it? She asked. She asked it without hope, without angling. She genuinely wanted to know. Daniel thought about load-bearing walls, about the invisible architecture of what holds and what gives, and the long, slow period between the two when everything still looks fine from the outside. I think we were trying, he said. I just think we were trying alone. She nodded. She looked out the window. He knew us better than we knew each other, she said. Her voice was quiet. That's the thing I can't get out of my head. He walked into our house, and within 3 weeks, he understood us better than we did. Because he was looking, Daniel said. We'd stopped. A long pause. The coffee shop hummed gently around them. She reached across the table, not for his hand, but near it. A proximity that wasn't asking for anything, just acknowledging that something had been real and was no longer available in that form. I'm sorry, she said, for what might have been the 3rd or 4th time in the months between. Each time it meant something slightly different. I know, he said. They sat a little longer. There was nothing fraudulent about the silence. It was, oddly, one of the more honest conversations they'd had in years, here at the end of things, when there was nothing left to protect. He paid for the coffees. She didn't argue. Outside, they stood on the pavement for a moment in the pale March sun. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, he said. She walked toward the crossing. He watched her go with the particular attention of someone studying a structure for the last time, committing to memory the lines of something that will be demolished before morning. Not from cruelty, but because some things cannot be reinforced, only understood, only quietly. Finally mourn, he turned and walked the other way. The street carried both of them in opposite directions, and the city continued, indifferent and enormous, and neither of them looked back. Not from coldness, but because they had both, at last, learned something about the cost of looking too late. In the end, what Marcus Holt took from them was not the money and not the marriage, though he took both. What he took was their last remaining story about why things had gone wrong, the comfortable version in which the fault was external. The wound was clean, and the cause had a name and a face and a packed weekend bag. What he left behind was only the truth. Two people who had slowly, carefully, and without malice made a life together that neither of them quite fit inside anymore. He had simply found the door they'd already left unlocked and walked through it and taken what was there. They would not have thanked him for the clarity. But clarity it was,